Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar today that is put on courtesy of Ocean Energy Systems Environmental, the U.S. Department of Energy, and Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. I am Andrea Copping, and I will be presenting today with my two colleagues, Michaela Freeman and Deborah Rose. All right, for today's webinar, we're just going to do a little introduction and some background and context for what OES-Environmental does, some resources and tools that are available in the US, and we're really going to hone in on what we've called our guidance documents associated with risk retirement, and we'll get into all that as we go along. But we really are tremendously interested in, besides providing information to you, we really want your feedback. We'd like to hear your discussion. We'd like to know how useful these tools are and how we can make them more useful for you. And then we'll end with some next steps. Next slide, please. So what we're really trying to do today, we have been engaging with the marine renewable energy community. Today is specifically for regulators and their advisors, and that's why you have all been invited here. We want to share these tools and resources, and we hope that they're useful to support your decision making and solicit feedback, as I said. Okay, I guess I said all that. Next slide. All right, OES-Environmental. Many of you have probably heard this from us before, but for those of you that haven't, Ocean Energy Systems is a collection, a group, a committee of countries under the International Energy Agency who are committed to developing marine energy around their coastlines. And by marine energy, I need to tell you, we are talking about wave, tidal, ocean current, anything that's moved or generated from the ocean water. This does not include offshore wind. However, much of what we have to say, I think, is applicable to offshore wind, particularly floating wind, but also fixed bottom. And I know many of you are in the process of having to look at applications for offshore wind. So I hope you'll hang in with us. So OES has a series of tasks under it, and the one we're working on, OES-Environmental, was established in 2010 by OES. The way a task works is a country gets together with a few other countries and determines that there is use in pursuing a topic. And this particular topic is examining environmental effects of marine energy with the purpose of being able to permit, or in other countries, consent devices in the waters to move the industry forward, but also so we have sufficient devices to really understand them better, because we are somewhat stymied with not having the ability to collect empirical data around devices. This particular task is led by the U.S. Department of Energy's Water Power Technologies Office in partnership with BOEM and NOAA, and it's implemented by the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. I act as the operating agent and I'm responsible to OES. We have been going, as you see, for now 12 years, and we've been re-upped several times for the longest running task for OES. And this particular time, we have 16 countries participating. All of the activities that we carry out, as well as many other resources, are documented on Tethys. There's the URL there. I think many of you are familiar with it. If not, I'd sure invite you to go and visit and engage. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is OES-Environmental's focus? We are trying to understand environmental effects of marine energy, bring that information and data together for analysis purposes, and share that knowledge broadly with the marine renewable energy community. And that includes, obviously, regulators and advisors, also the developers and their consultants, the research community, and other stakeholders. We approach this from the stressor-receptor interaction point of view, where the stressors are those parts of the systems that may stress, cause injury, or even death to animals or harm habitats and ecosystem processes. And the receptors, of course, are the animals, the habitats, etc. After a number of years of work with colleagues around the world, we've come down to these 7 stressors that we think are the important ones. And this is probably quite familiar to a number of you who have been working in this field, but they include collision risk. In this case, we're talking about underwater, tidal turbines, but this really applies to, offshore wind turbines and birds as well, although a little more is known there than the underwater version. The effects of underwater noise may cause on marine animals, particularly marine mammals and some fish, interrupting, masking, communication, navigation, etc. The effects of electromagnetic fields on sensitive marine organisms that are emitted from export power cables and energized devices. Changes in habitats, both benthic habitats and pelagic habitats due to the presence and operation of devices. And mooring line encounter. For those floating devices or devices high up in the water column that have mooring lines and perhaps draped cables, there is concern raised that this may be an entanglement or encounter for large marine mammals, etc. And we have looked at that some, though again, no empirical data because there isn't enough out there. Changes in oceanographic systems. This is really all about changing circulation by removing energy and changing the flow, changing wave heights a little bit when you generate, take wave energy out, and looking at this on sort of a broad basis. And the final one, displacement or barrier effects, is one that we haven't been able to delve into much because this is really about the presence of many, many devices, perhaps changing migratory routes for animals or keeping animals from their critical or preferred habitats. And there simply aren't enough devices out there to be able to look at this. We do look to offshore wind for this, but it is a little bit different than the tidal and wave devices. So this is something that really needs to be sort of put to the future as we have more in the water. Next slide, please. Okay, so we have been tasked by OES and by the US Department of Energy to provide the information that allows this marine renewable energy industry, another of the low carbon, place-based industries, to move forward. And to do this, as I mentioned before, we simply have to get more devices in the water that'll allow us to collect data, test our hypotheses, and also validate the numerical models we're using for many things like changes in oceanographic conditions. And to do this, we are approaching this with four principles, if you will. First, the systematic sharing of information. Make sure that information that's been collected anywhere in the world is readily available to regulators, developers, and others, researchers, etc. We are looking to prepare an organized method of transferring that data and information, taking it from one project, let's say in another country or another type of device, and making it readily available and applicable to new applications. We are doing this through a deliberative documentation process we are calling risk retirement, and we'll get to what we mean by that in a moment. And finally, this final step that we're really going to focus on a good deal today is translating what we know from the science into more regulatory guidance, something that is just more accessible from the regulatory sort of context. Okay, next slide, please. Just want to give you a quick look at a few tools that are available. I mentioned Tethys. This is the webpage for Tethys. And it's just, you just have to look up tethys.pnnl.gov, or we've managed to make it Tethys now come up first on Google searches. There's a knowledge base. There's also a great deal of information, more information about OES-Environmental. This tool supports environmental effects of marine energy, but also wind, both land-based and offshore. So you'll find a great deal of information there. I think there's getting close to 8,000 documents, papers, reports. We archive webinars, et cetera, on there. One of the main outputs of OES-Environmental is a State of the Science report that we write every 4 years. We published one in September 2020. We'll be updating that in 2024. And that is available for download off Tethys. It's a kind of a big honking 300-page document, but I'm pretty confident at the time it was published, it really did contain all the information we know on the topics. There were 40 authors and contributors from 11 countries, so I think you'll find that useful, but it is pretty tough to get into the whole thing. There is a shorter executive summary. There are also a series of what we call short science summaries, which are 2-page synopses of many of the stressors, individual stressors or other topics, including such things as environmental monitoring gear and instrumentation, because a lot of that is really quite different than what we've been using for, say, other oceanographic processes. And finally, we're about to release an environmental effects of marine renewable energy brochure, which is about a 12 or 16 page brochure. This was really prompted by several other nations asking for information that could be used with new regulators coming on board, because with the advancement of offshore wind and marine energy, there is real buildup in every country, including the US, of course, of more regulators. And then you'll also find all the information around risk retirement and data transferability, which we are not going to go into in deep depth today, but Michaela and Debbie will give you a little bit of a look at. Our matrix, the first one listed there, is an organized fashion, an organized database, if you will, of all the available data sets that look at these stressors and receptors as they have been collected by already permitted projects, research studies, analogous industries, and so on. So we hope that will be a useful tool. And the guidance documents, which is really what we're going to dig into today. Next slide, please. I mentioned the State of the Science report. Here it is. I already said a lot of this. Every 4 years, we do have detailed knowledge on each of these stressors. Also focusing on uncertainties and knowledge gaps, really trying to lay out the research that needs to be done to move us forward. And we hope that's very accessible, and there you see the URL to download that. Next slide, please. Okay, so I just want to touch very briefly on this term, risk retirement and data transferability. What we are trying to do is make these data accessible. Through an organized process we've called data transferability. And we do look to analogous industries, we look to research projects, and we look to other projects that have been successfully permitted and in many cases deployed and operated around the world. We bring together all that current evidence and understanding, and we've had a whole series of expert workshops on specific stressors, for instance, one on EMF effects, one on noise effects, one on habitat, etc. Go ahead. But what do we mean by this risk retirement term? What we mean is that for certain interactions, the potential risks may be quite low and probably do not need to be investigated at every new project, but rather rely on the existing data, which you can get through this matrix and data transferability. We have worked with the expert, research and other communities to really look at whether we can retire some of these risks for small developments. And by this, we mean approximately 1 to 4 devices. We're not talking about large arrays at this point, but we're trying to move towards that. But we need to really establish this baseline of what we understand of interactions with small devices. The really important caveats around risk retirement. This does not replace or contradict any regulatory processes in any way, shape, or form. And although we are saying that for some of these small numbers of devices, we think we can retire the risks, that is, not do a full investigation at every new project, that doesn't mean they can't be re-examined and should be re-examined in the future as larger arrays are deployed, as new information becomes available, etc. And we also recognize, and we stress this with the development community every time we talk with them, that regulators are going to ask for site-specific data for new projects. We are just hoping to put those requests for site-specific data really focused on the highest risk interactions and be able to really add to the common knowledge base that we all work from. Okay, I just want to finish what I'm talking about with a quick nod to some other tools I want to make sure you're aware of. Primer is the one-stop shop, if you will. It is the centralized set of databases for marine renewable energy in the US, sponsored by the US Department of Energy. They have directed 3 of our national laboratories, including my laboratory, to bring all these existing databases, portals, knowledge hubs together. And this is actually where TETHIS resides. There is also a sister site called TETHIS Engineering, which is very similar to TETHIS, but focuses on the engineering technology aspects of marine energy rather than the environmental. The MHK Data Repository is the database where all Water Power Technology Office, DOE funded work on marine energy is, those recipients are required to upload those databases, and those are made, the metadata is made available immediately. Some of the proprietary data is embargoed for a period of time, but there are databases to download and a wealth of information there. Another aspect of it is the Marine Energy Projects database, which is actually just undergoing a major upgrade, but this is a location where you can go in and search for projects around the world, technologies, companies, etc. And all of these, with the exception of MHK Data Repository, are internationally focused. The MHK Data Repository is just US generated data. Another set of capabilities, Marine Energy Toolkit, contains data and information that is pertinent for marine renewable regulatory and permitting processes. And you see the URL there at marineenergy.app. And finally, on TETHIS, you can find the Regulatory Handbook for Marine Hydrokinetic Processes. This was a recently updated series of roadmaps and discussions, both federal and also for most of the coastal states that are engaging in marine energy development. So there's just some additional resources you might want to look to. Okay, at this point, I am going to hand this over to Debbie, but do feel free to post questions.
So yeah, as Andrea mentioned, some of the feedback that we've gotten so far is that we really need to move from the available science on to applying it towards regulatory processes. So this messy slide kind of shows our process with that. We worked on translating scientific information and reporting it in the State of the Science report and distilling it into some evidence bases for key stressors, and then applying the lenses of risk retirement and data transferability to develop the guidance documents for risk retirement, which is what I'm going to be focusing on next. So the guidance documents were developed for regulators, consenting and licensing projects, advisors who are assessing the information and informing regulators, and developers as they're preparing applications for a variety of purposes. Each of the components of the guidance documents is designed to move from this scientific evidence to application within a particular regulatory context to make information accessible and readily available. And as we mentioned before, it's important to note these guidance documents do not replace any regulation or national guidance, but are really meant to be a useful tool for engaging in these processes for marine renewable energy. The guidance documents themselves are organized into categories of regulations, and they include an overview for applying these concepts in the regulatory process. So there are 3 different types of guidance documents. There's the background document that provides the context for this effort, explains the purpose and application of information, description of regulatory categories, and a framework for application. So really kind of the backbone of this effort that covers more than what we can talk about simply today. There are also country-specific documents, which are being developed for each of the participating OES-Environmental countries by the representatives of that country in partnership with us. And these aim to provide the regulations and relevant efforts for each country and are intended primarily for developers to help understand country requirements. And then lastly, there are stressor-specific documents that present an overview for each stressor, links to available data and information, and details about where we're at with risk retirement for each of them. So I'm going to walk through each of these pieces in a little bit more detail, and Michaela will as well. So the guidance documents use these 4 main regulatory categories as the basis for translating between scientific evidence and applications for consenting and licensing. The 4 categories are species or populations at risk, habitat alteration or loss, effects on water quality, and effects on social and economic systems. The guidance document provides descriptions of each of these categories, as well as relevant information for consenting processes, such as baseline information needs and potential risks for each category. It also includes information on risk retirement within each category and a brief note on some caveats and application for understanding cumulative effects. So I'll walk through just a quick example of species and populations at risk to kind of go over what's in each of those documents. I will add the link to the background document in the chat after I finish presenting, just to let you get a chance to look at it yourself. But so for species and populations at risk, this is defined as species, populations, or subpopulations that are protected under legislations and regulations, such as endangered, threatened, vulnerable, et cetera, which can vary by the country of regulation, or species that are commercially, recreationally, or culturally valuable. This category includes baseline data that could include if species live in or migrate through an area and if they might be affected by a potential development, depending on the technology. The data could include characteristics of the species, such as species distribution, population size, life history, dynamics and structure and behavior, and characteristics of a MRE project site, such as the species diversity and abundance in the area. This information aids site selection and can help minimize or manage site and technology specific risks. And then the risks identified for this category include collision risk to marine mammals, fish, diving birds, sea turtles, underwater noise, habitat change, EMF impacts, and each of these affect a variety of different species depending on the area and the risk itself. An additional risk is potential entanglement of large marine mammals or displacement from areas in the event of large arrays. So it's just a brief overview of how we've sort of defined the species and or populations at risk category to move forward and connect between science and regulations. The next few slides show the overarching framework that we've developed for applying risk retirement within consenting processes. And I will note that this is a very general framework. I'm going to breeze through it to keep it simple, as most of you are familiar with the process. It's typically very iterative and back and forth. And we've tried to simplify it into a key image to represent the variety of regulations for each country and the process in a broad sense. So just broadly shows the sequential application of risk retirement to consenting or permitting processes and provide some links to resources throughout. So for step one, project scoping by developer, you can see here we've mapped out stressors and receptors for each regulatory category which are impacted. And it includes available data sources and evaluation for data transferability, any risks that can be retired, and a final check to make sure all stressors and receptors have been identified. So that was a quick breeze through what can be a very complicated process of environmental assessment or scoping assessment for step one. Step two, submission of an application, and step three is review. And we've identified potential for integration of data transferability and risk retirement in this process as this is evaluated and risks are attempted to be understood so that we can move forward. At this point, additional data collection can be requested either as baseline data prior to consent or as a condition of consent. And then finally, a project is consented or modified to receive consent or abandoned in the event of insurmountable barriers. So this is obviously quick breeze through what a lot of people's full-time work is. And the whole point of this is just to outline how risk retirement and data transferability fit into these consenting processes and move towards widespread adoption of this and provide some resources throughout. So another pause for questions. I just want to do a quick walk through a few of these questions. I'm going to put another link to the Jamboard in the chat in case you want to just provide feedback instead of ask particular questions if there's anything you're confused about. We won't walk through all of the Jamboard content like live, but it will be really helpful for us to collect information on how these tools we've presented, if it's been helpful, if you think you might use it, if you just need more time to look at it, and so on. So I will also add the link to the background document in the chat. But feel free to put any questions in the chat or raise your hand and ask as well.
So Debbie gave us a really quick overview of the country-specific documents. I'm not going to go too much into depth here, but just want to give you more of a feel for what's included in those. And then afterwards, if you're interested, you can go and use the link at the bottom here to look more into the country-specific documents. So the goal here is to develop country-specific documents for each of the 16 OES environmental countries, working with the country representatives to do so. They compile environmental regulations that are relevant for marine renewable energy, and these are really aimed for use by developers who are trying to navigate the permitting processes. But we hope that they do have application for the larger MRE community. They provide information on different regulatory jurisdictions, agencies or regulatory bodies, as well as key regulations and statutes for each environmental effect. And these are all based on the 4 regulatory categories that Debbie introduced us to. There's also additional information that may be relevant, such as any information on marine spatial planning or adaptive management, any other kind of regulatory guidance that a developer might want to be aware of for trying to permit in a specific country. I do want to note that the documents aren't meant to be comprehensive of all regulations and details, but rather provide an overview that can help a developer who's putting a project in the water. And I think that stands true for all of the guidance documents. They're really meant to be kind of shorter documents that you can look into with tons of links for where you can find additional information and kind of delve into, but really just a starting point through that permitting process. Next slide, please. So the last piece of the guidance document, we've been over the background document and the country-specific document, and I'm going to spend a bit of time here on the stressor-specific document. And through it, I'm going to also show a little bit about the evidence base and the matrix as well. So these stressor-specific documents really bring together the current knowledge on these stressor-receptor interactions to make the data and information easily available in kind of, again, this short form format. So far, we've developed them for 4 interactions: underwater noise, electromagnetic fields, habitat change, and changes in oceanographic systems. Each document includes background on the interaction, links to existing data and information, some information on the pathway to risk retirement, and recommendations for gaining additional knowledge and understanding. I'm going to walk through each of the specifics of the document by showing a quick example using the habitat change document. So I do not show this to make everyone read this, but rather just to familiarize you all with the stressor-specific guidance documents and what you can expect to find within them. We really kind of wanted to dive more in depth into what the guidance documents actually look like and what do they contain, so that hopefully you can navigate through them a little bit easier on your own later. Ask questions of us now, gain your feedback on, is this document useful? And just kind of, again, provide an overview of what this entails. So at the top, you'll see those like navy blue and orange rectangle boxes, and that's just pointing out back to the figure that Debbie showed in her one of the first slides on the guidance documents, just kind of the broad kind of view of the guidance documents and where this fits in. We then have an introduction to the interaction, which is just a high-level overview of what we mean by habitat change, how that might affect marine animals or the environment. Followed by this little diagram that is pulled from the framework, so you can see where the regulatory category fits in to this stressor receptor interaction and what receptors we're talking about when we talk about habitat change. Next slide, please. So the next portion of the stressor-specific document is existing data and information, and this is where I want to focus a little bit. We've talked about the 2020 the State of the Science already and the TETHIS knowledge base, so I'm going to show you the evidence bases and the monitoring data sets discoverability matrix, which I will call the matrix for the rest of it since it is a bit of a mouthful. So first, I'm going to walk through the evidence bases, and I'm hoping to get at the question that was put on the Jamboard that talks about what is our basis for saying a risk is retired and how do we get to that point. So please do ask me questions to follow up if I haven't answered your question, but I'm hoping that I'll get at that here. So the evidence bases were really created to help us identify potential stressor receptor interactions, assess the available data and information, and see which ones are right for risk retirement. We started by compiling key research papers, monitoring reports, and documents that could inform risk retirement for, again, these small numbers of devices. And we did this kind of around the same time as the 2020 State of the Science. And when we do those, we do very comprehensive literature review. So we were able to really look at all the current information being put out there and what are those really key pieces of information that can tell us, are we seeing impacts from a certain stressor receptor interaction? What is the level of those impacts, and can it really be considered retired, or do we need to know more about it? So the evidence bases have been compiled again for these 4 interactions that we kind of been focusing on. For electromagnetic fields, there are 16 key documents within that evidence base. Underwater noise has 29 documents. Habitat change has 60 key documents, which makes sense as habitat change we're able to learn from a lot of analogous industries or really just other things put in the marine environment and seeing what those impacts are. So that has a few more key documents there. And then changes in oceanographic systems has 23 documents. We have the link at the bottom here, again, if you want to explore what those evidence bases look like and dig a little bit more into each of those. So once the evidence bases for each of these potential risks were gathered, we assessed the data and information and the potential to retire the risk, and we described also how it can be applied to new projects. Each evidence base was reviewed and discussed by experts through international conferences and online workshops, as well as expert consultations. And based on the information compiled, this review and discussion with experts, there was really agreement on these 4 interactions that for small numbers of devices, we consider these risks retired. Again, all of the evidence bases can be found on this risk retirement page on TETHIS. And if you're interested more about the process of how we considered it, what is that information you'll find? We actually have 2 recorded webinars, one from 2020 and 2021, that go into more detail for each of these stressors. And you'll find that also on the risk retirement page. There's an outreach and engagement section, and we have all of our previously recorded webinars there. And so we walk through each of the evidence bases for these 4 interactions and what's included. I'm happy to answer questions now about it, but those 2 webinars are a wealth of information for that. So on this next slide, I do want to show an example of what kind of information you'll see in the evidence base. This is a clip again from that stressor specific document, so it'll look a little bit different when you navigate through it on TETHIS. But within the stressor specific document for habitat change, at the bottom, we have the selection of studies from the evidence base. And so I just wanted to pull out an example of information you'll see. And so this study was conducted down in Oregon around the kind of PacWave site. It's an assessment of benthic effects of anchor presence and removal. And the study found that there was no significant difference between areas around anchors and control sites, either during operation or removal of the anchors. And so this is one study that informed the ability to retire this risk or not. Of course, as I mentioned, for habitat change, there are 60 key documents in there. So there's a lot more detail to dive into there, but I did just want to pull out this one to, show the different studies that you'll be able to find. I see a quick question. Do the evidence bases have metadata so we can search for keywords? I don't think so. Debbie, correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think they're there, but I'm going to get into the matrix on the next slides, and there you'll be able to search in a little bit more detail, and also within the knowledge base as well. So let me go into the matrix actually on the next slide. That's a great segue. And then if you still have a question about how you can find more information specifically on these afterwards, I'm happy to come back to that question. So next, the tool that we highlight in the stressor-specific documents for existing data and information is our monitoring datasets discoverability matrix. This tool was developed by OES-Environmental after talking mostly with regulators and advisors about the ability to transfer data to aid consenting, and continuing to hear that there was really this need to easily find and access data to be able to transfer it. And so actually working a number of years in different workshops with US regulators, we kept hearing this. And so we decided to build this matrix. It's an interactive online tool that guides data transfer, and it makes data sets from existing projects accessible so that hopefully regulators and the larger MRE community can transfer data for consenting future projects using what we already know to inform new projects. The matrix is categorized by 6 interactions: collision risk, underwater noise, electromagnetic fields, habitat change, oceanographic systems, and displacement. And in addition, the matrix also identifies characteristics to help easily find relevant data, which I've shown at the bottom of the slide here. Each set of characteristics is specific to the interaction, so these change a little bit, but in general, it includes a stressor, the receptor, site conditions, technology type, and project size. And even though the overall characteristics are in these same categories, they're very specific to each interaction. I think I saw Debbie put the link to the matrix in the chat, so you're welcome to explore it now, but I might encourage you to wait because there's a lot of detail there. So I'm going to show a little bit how to navigate it in the next slide. So when you pull up the matrix on TEPIS, you'll see at the top the different interactions. We do have habitat change split into water column and benthic habitat. Andrea kind of explained that difference a little bit in the beginning of our presentation. And so what this allows you to do is you can go in, you can choose which interaction you're interested in. I'm going to show you the habitat change water column interaction here. And first, when you pull it up, you'll only see the stressor and the receptors. So you can choose which ones you're interested in based on what that future project is that you're permitting, or if a developer were to use it, the future project that they're trying to put in the water and what they may be concerned about. So for this application, we're looking at maybe a hypothetical future project where we're interested in fish, and it will be a bottom-mounted project with mooring lines and gravity bases. And so we're interested in data that is relevant to that. So once you select all of your selections there, you click at the top right, view results. And when you pull that up, you'll get an output that looks similar to this. So the basis for the matrix really comes from that OES-Environmental metadata that Andrea briefly mentioned. Metadata is information on environmental effects from MRE project sites that mainly come from developers themselves and is their baseline and post-installation monitoring that they've done and other details about the projects. We also collect metadata on active research studies. And so you'll see those two in the first 2 tables. And then we've also included key documents as part of the results here with the matrix. And those are coming from that same evidence base. So this is another way that you can get into the results from the evidence base with a little bit more specificity. You'll see at the top for baseline and post-installation monitoring, that selection is true to what you filled out in the matrix, all of those different characteristics that you've chosen. The research studies are only actually characterized by stressor and receptor, since they don't have all of those same project details as you would get from the metadata project sites. And then the key documents are specific just to that stressor. So we've tried to provide as robust of information as you can find here. I'm not going to click into it now, but if you click on any of the titles here, you'll go to the actual page with the information on it. And for the baseline and post-installation monitoring, you'll go to specifically the data that's available from that project site. Included on those project site metadata forms is a list of a name and an email address. You do have to be logged into TPIS to access that email address, but you can then contact who filled out the form to get access to the actual data set. All right, and the last step here with the stressor-specific guidance documents, as I mentioned, is that pathway to risk retirement, what the evidence suggests for habitat change for these small-scale developments. We've seen from the evidence base and from working with experts that we can consider this retired, and recommendations where we might need some additional information. So for instance, we've highlighted the need for understanding cumulative effects as more devices are placed in the water and collecting data that increases the knowledge of both spatial and temporal scales of habitat change. So that was a really quick overview of kind of some of those tools and the stressor specific documents, but I wanted to provide a place or I guess the ability for us to talk about these in a little bit more depth and get your feedback on the stressor specific documents and some of those additional OES environmental tools. So to wrap up the guidance documents, I just wanted to show a quick overview of how all these different pieces fit together and where we are in the process. So far we've completed the background documents, which includes those descriptions of regulatory categories and the framework that Debbie provided a brief overview of. For the stressor specific documents, as I mentioned, we've completed electromagnetic fields, underwater noise, habitat change, and oceanographic systems. We will be working on collision risk, entanglement, and displacement, but those will kind of come in the future, especially as information is more available. Collision risk especially is one of the more tricky interactions where there's still a lot of information we need to gain before we can really consider that retired or even get close to it. So we're currently working on that. There's a lot of efforts going on with OES-Environmental to dig deep into some of these. As far as the country-specific documents go, we have completed documents for the United States, for Wales, for China, and Japan. And we have draft versions for Australia and France, which will hopefully be available soon. And as I mentioned earlier, we plan to have documents for all of the other OES environmental countries. And we hope to also have translations of some of the documents as well, so that they're available in the country's native language. Those shown in gray, as I mentioned with the stressor documents, we'll start drafting in the future and hopefully have those available. So keep checking back on that link that we have here on the top as we're adding new information all the time. So the next slide, I just wanted to briefly call out our outreach and engagement process. I think as we mentioned earlier in this, we're really aiming to make this an iterative and collaborative process that really engages the international marine renewable energy community. Each aspect of the guidance document we presented and what I showed on the last slide is kind of completed, has gone through a feedback and review process with the OES environmental country representatives for the 16 countries, as well as additional experts, especially for the stressor documents in those subject areas. We've presented the guidance documents to gain feedback to UK regulators and analysts, as well as the Welsh marine renewable energy community. They're in particular very interested in risk retirement and applying these concepts as they're seeing a lot of movement of MRE development in Wales. So it's been really great to engage them on this process. We've also given a public webinar. The one I mentioned earlier is recorded from this past year. And conducted workshops with the international marine renewable energy community where we've talked through the guidance documents and also asked for feedback. Throughout these, we've really gained a lot of positive feedback on the guidance documents. And we hope that from this webinar, you'll see at the end, we have a survey as well as the Jamboards will continue to stay available for a while for you to add to it. But we really are genuinely interested in gaining your feedback on, are these useful? Are they applicable? Is there something that would make them more so? And how might you apply them? So we would really love to hear more from you about that. But in addition to these 2 workshops this week, we're aiming to engage regulators in the other OES environmental countries for additional feedback. As I mentioned earlier, we aim to have these applicable on an international basis. So with that, I think I have one more slide for questions and discussion. Any last minute general comments, questions? How can we best support you with these existing tools or new tools? As I mentioned, the matrix that I showed you came about from a lot of conversations about needing accessible, easy access to available data and information. And so hearing kind of what your needs are can help us better support you and develop some of those additional tools that might be useful. Are there other resources we can provide you? And then other groups who you think might be interested in this information that we can engage with.
Okay, thanks so much, Michaela and Debbie. So what happens next? We are going to ask you to do a survey on the next slide. The Jamboards will still be up there for a period of time if you want to look at them. We'll be reviewing those and pulling the feedback together along with what we get from the workshop on Thursday, as Michaela mentioned. We will continue our engagement with the marine renewable energy regulatory community, both here in the US and also in the other OES countries. We encourage the OES analysts, the representatives from those countries, to run those, participate with us, and so on. Particularly where there are small, and in some of the European countries, there's really a very small number of regulators. And so being able to really engage with them on a personal level is important. We mentioned that there's some interactions we haven't gotten there yet. And I want to just give you a little peek of what we're working on now. We're continuing to work on collision risk. This is a very tough one because, as I mentioned before, we're trying to prove something won't happen, that animals won't run into a blade. And how long do you need to do 24/7 observation of a tidal turbine to know whether this is a real risk or not? It's also a very tough place to work. We are also starting to work more in tropical and subtropical ecosystems. Much of what we've done has been temperate and it's been northern hemisphere. And I think we all know as biologists that tropical ecosystems are a great deal more complex and different biodiversity than temperate systems. So we're starting to really look at what that might look like. And that will also entail some slightly different technologies that are more viable in the tropics, like ocean thermal energy conversion, cold deep water to warm surface water. We will be looking at displacement more. There doesn't seem to be a really good common definition of what we mean by this, animals being thrown off their migratory routes or moved off their preferred habitats. We'll be working on that. We also are taking on 3 new effects, 3 new potential areas of interest. One is cumulative effects. How does adding marine renewable energy to a landscape that already has other anthropogenic effects? Obviously, it's not a pristine ocean or an empty ocean out there. We have fishing pressures, we have shipping, recreation, and conservation set-asides, et cetera. So how does that all come together? We are also taking an ecosystem approach where we're really trying to understand not just these individual receptors we've been talking about, like certain marine mammal species or benthic species, but how does this all work together? And how will marine energy affect those ecosystem connections, including how will it affect present ecosystem services? And all of this is, of course, against a backdrop of climate change. And the third one I alluded to before, really trying to think about scaling up to arrays. We've been talking about these small numbers of devices. How do we understand how we can interpret this information to get towards what larger array effects might be? So those are ones we're actively working on now. Those latter three are actually led by other OES analysts from other countries: Cumulative Effects out of Australia, Ecosystem Approach out of France, Scaling Up to Arrays out of Canada. But we do have participants from many of the countries working on those committees working on this. So that's about it. I would like to invite you, if you haven't already, to sign up for Tethys Blast, which is our bi-weekly email newsletter that'll tell you what's new in the field, what's new on Tethys, news and events, webinars, etc. So please, if you haven't, please sign up there. And there's a webinar mailing list as well if you go to Tethys and subscribe Tethys. Okay, next slide, please. So if you're willing, we would very much like you to fill out a survey. It's important to us to know whether this was a good use of your time. If you use your smartphone to grab that QR code, you can take that survey directly. Or there's also, of course, the link right here. And we would very much appreciate your participation there. And there's the Jamboard link once again, which I know Debbie has in the chat. If you want to go back and look at the Jamboard and add to it after this, it'll still be live. So there's our email links. We would love to hear from you anytime. We hope this has been useful to you. We do appreciate the time you spent with us. We know how valuable everybody's time is, and everybody's sick of being online anyway. But we hope it was useful, and we would love to hear from you through these processes or any other way. So thank you.